just be prepared.
Yeah. Hi there, everybody. This is S.J. Thomason, and it's Christian-apologist.com. Truth matters. I've decided to have a new little slogan because it's very important that we have the truth. And today we're here with Real Seekers Dale. He's been with me before talking about the Shroud of Turin. And today we have a new guest that we haven't brought on before. He's named Larry Stalley, and Larry has been a pastor for 44 years. He just recently stepped down. He was at the Newport, Washington Community Church for many of those years, and then he was at a different church before that. He met his wife as a freshman in Bible college. How cool is that? And he went through an experience where he had a bout with death, and he feels that Christ reached out to him and saved him. And so he's spent many years studying recent years studying the Shroud, and he retired recently to go ahead and start writing on the Shroud. And so he's going to share some of what he knows with respect to the Shroud in the Bible. And so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dale and Larry and just let you rock.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for having me back and for bringing on Larry. I think on the topic we're covering today, the possible mentions of the Shroud images in the New Testament, Larry is by far the best proponent on that front. So I'm grateful to have you here, Larry. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Dale. Thank you, Stephanie, for having me. It's an honor.
Awesome. So yeah, I think the first thing we're going to do, the main topic today, you're going to be focusing on your positive cases, selecting maybe a few texts as to what you think are positive references to the Shroud images. But before we get to that, I just want to very quickly address some of the Shroud skeptics, because people will be surprised to know that a lot of Shroud skeptics are actually fellow Christians, and they raise biblical objections that they say rule out the Shroud of Turin. So on that front, I've got about 4 objections. And the first thing I just want to point over to you, Larry, is the obvious one. Look, the Shroud of Turin images, what are you talking about? I've read the Gospels, I've read the New Testament. There are no explicit mentions of the Shroud of Turin. So what are you talking about? Why are there no explicit mentions there?
Well, Dale, that's an excellent place to begin. And I can identify with that skepticism, because when I first heard about the Shroud some years ago, I thought, oh, that's nonsense. That's foolishness. I mean, who can believe that? And so I was very much a skeptic to begin with, even a cynic. And I read a article one day by Gary Habermas, well-known New Testament professor, Liberty University, expert in the resurrection. Anyway, he suggested it might be authentic. And I thought, what? No way, but it intrigued me that I began to research it and just became fascinated with the subject. So that's a good question, the skepticism. Well, I recall how John Calvin made that very argument about this particular Shroud. He said, surely this cannot be authentic, because the gospel writers would not have failed to have made mention of it. So I thought, well, that's a pretty good argument. I like that. But there's a couple of inferences I think that we can make to counter that. Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, don't give that which is holy to the dogs. Don't cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them underfoot, and then they turn and tear you to pieces. And what could have been more holy to the early church than a burial shroud that had the holy blood, that had the blood of Jesus on it, the sacrificial blood? And so, and if we get into the one of the texts in Hebrews, I think we'll see a lot of the significance the early church saw in that regard as a consecrated garment. So that's one reason. And in the church, then there developed what was called the discipline of the secret. And what was that secret? And I think it basically revolved around the shroud, because as Jesus said, don't cast your pearls before swine. So we know a lot of persecution in the early church. For example, Saul of Tarsus and the martyrdom of a lot of the early Christians, and Peter had to flee Jerusalem. So the idea that they were discreet, I believe, and how this shroud was handled, lest if the enemies of the faith became aware of it or government officials, they may have wanted to hunt it down. And if they found it, confiscate it, maybe harm it, destroy it. So I think there's a good reason in that regard for secrecy.
Gotcha. Awesome. All right, cool. So, okay, so the next second of the four objections is one you probably have heard all the time. I know I do, but Christians will say, "Look, read your Bible, pal. The Gospel of John, chapter 19 and chapter 20, they talk about Jesus being wrapped in linen strips, plural. The shroud
Right.
is just one gigantic cloth. So obviously they contradict. The Shroud of Turin is not the burial shroud mentioned in the Gospel of John, is it?"
Well, again, that's a good question. And in fact, I'll go back to John Calvin. That was his second argument against this particular cloth. He says, if you believe in the Bible, you believe in what John wrote, you can't believe in this burial shroud because it's just one long linen sheet. And as you said, the orthenia, the funeral linens in the plural that John used there. Well, I think in countering that, we could say that each of the synoptic gospels, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, each of the first three gospels make mention of the singular sidon, the burial cloth, the burial shroud. And even Luke, who uses the same term that John uses, the orthenia, the funeral linens. Luke, after he mentions the sidon, that he was wrapped in the sheet of linen, during the resurrection narrative, we'll talk about the orthenia. He mentions that word too. So I think that we should expect that there was more than just this linen long sheet in the burial process. In fact, on the side strip of the Shroud of Turin is about a 3-inch strip that we know has been removed and re-sewn onto the shroud. We think it was a part of the original shroud, and then it was cut and sewn back. And what purpose did it serve? And I think a good answer is if you look today how people are prepared for burial in the Middle East, it's much the same way. One long sheet, and then it'll be bound with a strip of linen. You tie the corpse to the cloth and the feet and the head and such. And so some scholars think too that there's it may have been the headband. And so I just think that there was probably more than just this one long sheet. Yeah. And I think if we get into John chapter 20, further in that text, we can explain more what's going on there.
Gotcha. Yeah, exactly. And Gary Habermas talks about the chin strap. Oh, go ahead.
Dale, let me, if I could, I thought of something else about that first question you had about the secrecy. Why don't we find it mentioned? Besides the idea of persecution and confiscation, the second commandment said, "Thou shalt not make any graven image unto thyself." So the Jews had strong prohibitions against the images of men. Caesar wanting to bring the emblems of men and even put them in the temple. I mean, yeah, that was just a no-no. That was forbidden. So the idea that at least in the Jewish areas, they may have had to be even more cautious showing this shroud. First of all, stained with blood. Is it unholy? And then is it a graven image? And I think the early Christians thought, no, it's not a graven image because it's not made by man; it's made by God. Mm-hmm. This is something that and there's texts that back that up. So I just wanted to add that second reason.
Awesome. Yeah, and I see SJ put up. We had Joe Marino in the audience, so he's watching and giving you. So.
Yeah, I want to say hi to Joe real quick, and hi to Susan, and hi to Captive Deska. Actually, Captive Desk, it's funny because Real Seekers predicted you were going to come here.
I knew it. Yep. He's got some good comments. Obviously, we disagree. He's a Shroud skeptic, but yeah, it's good to have people with an opinion. So let's move on to the third biblical objection against the Shroud of Turin then. And this is one I've heard only a couple times, but it's an appeal to the prophet Isaiah, chapter 52, verse 14, specifically, where it says, "Just as there were many who were appalled at him," speaking of the Messiah, "his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond all human likeness." So basically, these Christians are saying, well, look, the shroud man, he looks to me to be in the form of a human being. He's not marred beyond all human likeness and form. So how can this be a fulfilled prophecy then?
Okay, another good question. I haven't heard that before, but I think I certainly can respond to it. The man of the cloth was tortured, and tortured very severely. And the scourging that he underwent was, I think, such that we read in the Gospels, Pilate was hoping that would satisfy the Jews. So he got a severe flogging, and that didn't satisfy the Jews. But if this is Jesus, this person underwent a horrific torture. And so how do you describe that? Well, the text you read, I think that'd be one way. You could call it hyperbole. I mean, I don't think we take everything exactly literal. You can't recognize him. He's beaten that so much. That's just a way of emphasizing the guy was really tortured.
Yeah, exactly. I fully agree with what you said. Look, forget the shroud. If you're interpreting this hyper literally, like, Jesus was like the Messiah is predicted to be like a blob of goo. Well, then you're ruling out Jesus of the Gospels too. You're not a Christian anymore. So, it's just kind of ridiculous taking this hyper literal. One thing, just before I move on to the fourth thing, Jamie Russell, Christian Middle Earth. Did I catch David Falk's criticism recently? Absolutely, I did. And I actually did a response video because I don't know if you know this, SJ, but David Falk is a famous Egyptologist and Christian. And he did a video a couple days ago debunking the shroud on the basis of our videos, SJ, at least in part.
Really?
Yeah, he saw our videos, and that prompted him to kind of look into it. But on my channel, Real Seekers, I've done a full refutation video of his arguments that he raises there. So
that is interesting, because I've had him on my channel a couple times. I consider him a friend, so I'll have to, hopefully he did it in a friendly manner. I'm sure he did, probably.
Oh, son of a gun. Okay, well, you got to tell him to come on my show, because I've been trying to get him to come on and talk about the Exodus. But anyways, okay, cool. So Larry, let me get back. The fourth and final biblical objection against the Shroud of Turin is 1 Corinthians chapter 11. You hear it time and time again, right? The shroud man depicts a medieval depiction of a man. He's got long hair and a beard. Look, Jesus in the first century, he would have been in the Greco-Roman style, clean-shaven, short hair. And Paul even tells us that it is a shame for a man to have long hair. So doesn't that kind of rule out the shroud man then? Jesus would have had short hair, not long hair like he has.
The man of the cloth does have shoulder-length hair, and even in the back, there's evidence that he has it in a pigtail. And we think that was a Jewish dress, hairstyle. We believe this person who was crucified was Jewish. Now, Corinth was a Roman colony, and the Romans had different cultural beliefs, as cultures do. And as you mentioned, their gods, often short hair, the Greek, the Roman gods. But in Judaism, of course, you got the Nazareth vow. And if you take that literal, as you've quoted it as far as Paul, why would God have given the Nazareth vow, Samson with long hair? So I think we have to understand the milieu, that culture. And there's later in that text, it says, decide for yourself. Is it proper for a woman to be veiled? A lot, I think what's going on there is a cultural, the Roman worship of their priests veiled was counter to the Jewish milieu. There's a difference between the Roman worship and how they dressed, and then the Jews. And I think there are things going on in that congregation that were challenging the accepted norms of the day. Mm-hmm. And I think that's more what he's countering there. But I guess my main question would be, or my main counter is that I don't think it's always wrong to have long hair, as many would interpret that. Otherwise, the Nazarene vow, it seems, would be counter to that.
Yeah, I fully agree. And again, like you said, the definition of, as Gary Habermas argues, the definition of long hair is cultural specific, right? So shoulder length hair was considered short hair in the first century. We can't have a 1950s understanding of short versus long hair, right? And
Yeah. I mean, in some cultures, it's just not right for a man to dress like a woman, and in that sense too, for in that culture where a woman is valued with long hair and men are not, and then men start to have long hair, that's not, judge for yourself. Is this proper in this culture?
Yeah, exactly. My old pastor, he taught a great sermon on this actually, and it's not even about necessarily about the hair lengths. It's more about the hairstyles, because when you look at the women, right? If they were leaving their fancy wigs at home to say like, oh, we're all equals, but they had shaved heads. In that culture, that meant you're a prostitute. If you're a woman, you're not supposed to have a shaved head. You should, Paul's saying, put on your wigs. Don't mix up hairstyles and stuff. So
the cultural. I think you're right, Dale. That's what I would say.
Awesome. All right, cool. Well, that does it. Those are all of the biblical objections against the Shroud of Turin being biblically authentic. So I want to switch gears to the main thing then. Let's put the burden of proof on you, Larry, and maybe start off with your first text and what you want to present. What are some of the biblical texts that prove there were shroud images known in the century?
Yeah, I'm very, very happy to share what the Lord has revealed to me. I feel blessed and honored, and so thank you for that opportunity. There's I would say 3 pillars of evidence for the authenticity of the shroud. There's science, and there's so much that's been done in recent decades. Stirp scientific team and so many others. That's largely why I came to believe it's authentic. All the scientific evidence that supports it. You also have the second pillar would be historical references or artifacts, like the Pantocrator icon from the St. Catherine Monastery in Egypt. That's mid 6th century. The likeness of that image with the shroud is pretty strong. You have the Justinian II, his gold coin that he paid his soldiers with. That's 692. That image of Christ is from the shroud, the source. You've got the Pray manuscript from the late 12th century. You've got the Siderium of Oviedo that we can date back to Spain to the early 7th century. I think it's 616. So there's some good historical evidence, and others that I deal with as far as the early church, like the inscription of Abercius. That's about 190, 192, 196. So science, history, but then there's the biblical text. And this is where I think the theologians and the Bible scholars, that we are far behind the research, the scientists and the historians. We've not done enough textual studies. And so I'm blessed to have the opportunity to share some of the work I've done. I actually believe that we have 4 canonical authors that make strong veiled references to the shroud. I say veiled or hidden for the reason we earlier discussed about the need for secrecy and the discipline of the secret. But I think we have not 1, not 2, but as many as 4 of the writers of the New Testament that have not 1, but more than 1, each of those 4 references to the shroud. And what I could do is give you a brief introduction to those, and then those that are more interesting, we can go back and do more thoroughly if you'd like.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so the one that probably most people are familiar with is in Galatians chapter 3, verse 1. Paul says to the Galatians, woe you Galatians, who has bewitched you, who has cast the evil eye upon you. Before your eyes, Jesus Christ was publicly displayed, openly exhibited, portrayed as having been crucified. Well, how did that happen? To these pagan converts, 20 years, he's writing approximately 20 years after the crucifixion, hundreds of miles away from Jerusalem. How did they see Jesus Christ crucified? With their eyes? And so the way this is predominantly understood in the commentaries is a preaching metaphor, that Paul, by his preaching, so graphically depicted the cross that it was as if they were right there at Calvary, the preaching metaphor. So there's a number of objections we could make to that. He doesn't. Well, first of all, this verb to graphically depict was the common verb to post a public notice. We have from the first century a document where a father posts the notice he's not going to be responsible for his son's debts. I'm not going to pay off my son's debts. And so this is the common word for a public posting on a signboard, a placard. And so there's a number of arguments. I want to move on. So I'm going to say this, that in Galatians 1:18, I think that's the verse, Paul says that he went down to Jerusalem. He visited with Peter for, I think it was 8 days or a week. The verb that's used there is hystereo. And my English version, New American Standard Version, he went to get acquainted. King James, I think he went down there to see Peter. RSV, he went down to visit Peter. Well, hystereo, we got the noun form is hysteria. We got a word history from it. And it's really to investigate, to inquire. I think Elvis familiar with Lee Strobel, investigative journalist, and his work on Christian evidences and that's the idea, I think, is that he went down and he inquired of Peter about the origins of Christianity and the gospel that Peter preached. And then Paul says he went down 3 years later and he met James and John. So he's met the very two people who entered the tomb on resurrection morning and found the burial cloth. And so I don't see how he could have investigated them and been, spent 7 to 8 days with them and didn't become aware of the shroud. And so there's a number of arguments we can make about the preaching, against the preaching metaphor. But basically, I don't see how Paul could be so explicit in what, before your eyes, Jesus Christ was crucified. If the shroud is authentic, which I believe it is, then for him to say that and it not be the image on the shroud, it would be confusing and misleading to his readers. And so that's kind of the basic argument. It's speculation that he's just using a metaphor. Now, I know Ben Withington has gone further, and I think he's right in doing this, that he's left the preaching metaphor and gone to the metaphor of Paul's scars, which is more textual. That's in the text.
Yeah, because I'll just jump in quickly just for the audience and SJ. Larry was on my show doing a panel review where he was kind of in discussion with Ben Witherington. Mm-hmm. And Ben Witherington, he used to take that mainstream traditional, preaching metaphor thing, but he actually changed his mind. And now he's saying, well, what is it the Galatians saw? They saw the stigmata. And Larry's going to go into what he makes of that.
Yeah, so there's a couple of references that Paul makes. I have the stigmata on my body. And then right before this, Galatians 3:1, he does say, I've been crucified with Christ. So it definitely has a part in our interpretation. But I don't think Paul took his shirt off and said, hey, okay, here, look, I was stoned, at Lystra, whatever it was, and say, here's Christ crucified. There's a difference between saying I've been crucified with Christ and you saw Jesus Christ crucified. That is a hyperbole, you know. And the thing is, if they've seen the real thing, if they've seen the image of the crucifixion, then his point becomes strong. You know, I've identified with Christ. I have suffered for Christ. Here's the scars I have. They're not crucified scars, but I've taken up my cross, and I've suffered for the gospel. And so it's a way of identifying with with Christ. But it's one thing to say, hey, look at me, I'm Christ crucified, and to say I was crucified with Christ. You know, I've suffered, I've taken up my cross. Okay, so I think we can move on to so there's a number of other texts, and myself, that's not the strongest one that we have.
Oh, really? Okay, that's interesting, because I believe it or not, I think I used to be skeptical a bit, but I think that Galatians, I think you've kind of persuaded me slightly on a balance of probabilities, and I think the Galatians 3:1 is the strongest. But if you think there's a strong one, that's great. Just before we move on, though, SJ, do you have any questions about the Galatians 3:1 at all, or was it clear? Or?
No, it's very clear. So I think keep going.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. So I just in leaving that, I'm just saying it's speculation that Paul is just speaking metaphorically. He doesn't say I'm speaking metaphorically. He talks about his preaching. Hey, when I came to you, I didn't come with the power of persuasion. And one place he talks about, you know, they say of me, he's not a very good speaker. Now that's a paraphrase, but he says, you know, he's powerful in his letters, but when you see him in person, he's just a little guy. I think Paul, it doesn't that in Latin, doesn't that mean small? He's probably a little guy, you know. And he says, I'm not powerful in speech, but your letters are weighty. And so I don't find Paul in his letters even, you know, talking about, oh, Christ was just beaten so bad and so terrible. And so it's conjecture and speculation to say he's speaking metaphorically. And if the shroud is authentic and existed, he knew about it. And to say that they saw Christ crucified, some kind of graphic, prographo, we get our word graphics from this Greek verb. Painting or drawing is one way this prographo, or I should say grapho, can be, is the word to write, but sometimes it can be used to draw or to paint. Josephus uses it, as I recall, to paint. So they have had some kind of painting or drawing, it would seem, that graphically displays the crucifixion of Christ. Well, what better answer than the image on the shroud? And then after, right, just a couple verses later, he talks about the miracles that were worked among them. I'm of the persuasion that more than likely the shroud was used in the early church in miraculous, in the working of miracles. Just like Moses and Aaron had a staff, a rod, you know, divide the sea, and Elijah and Elisha had the mantle to divide the Jordan River. The Hebrew writer says that the gospel was delivered by Jesus to the apostles, and when they went out and preached, it was confirmed by God with miracles, signs and wonders. And so I don't think the shroud is there just to keep in a closet and never to be shown, but I think it was used in affirming the gospel, the preaching of these, it talks in Acts, now this is conjecture on my part, but it talks in Acts how handkerchiefs were brought to Paul and taken to the sick and they were healed. Yeah.
Acts 16, right?
Yeah. Maybe a handkerchief was put over the face of the shroud. You know, it says in the Gospels, if I could just touch his garment, I'll be healed. You know, the lady with the flow of blood and stuff. And so this idea, if I could just touch his garment and be healed. What's to say that the shroud wasn't used in a miraculous way like that, just like the rod and staff of Aaron, and there's a text we could go into that too. But anyway, that's we'll move on.
Yeah. Well, I'm interested in what do you think is the best text? If it's not Galatians 3:1,
let me mention a few others just real quick, and then we'll get there. Okay. We'll stay with Paul just for a moment, because I think, as I said, 4 canonical authors that have more than just one. So another one I think that should be considered concerning, and let me say this, I can't prove this. You can't take the scientific method because these things aren't repeatable, and we cannot go and ask Paul, what did you mean by Galatians 3:1? You know, he's not here. All we can do is come up with the explanations that are most plausible, and of those, which is more probable. And then people have to make their own decision as to how strong the evidence is. Okay, so you come to 1 Corinthians 13:12, and Paul says to the Corinthians, now we see dimly in a mirror, or now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now that first verb doesn't have an object. What is it that we are now seeing? He doesn't say. But if we look at the object of the second clause of that verb, see now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Well, that's the face of Christ. If we take that object for the first verb, now we are seeing the face of Christ in a mirror dimly. But when he returns, we'll see him face to face. I think that's a rational explanation of what Paul is saying there. Right now, we're seeing the face of Christ as if it was in a mirror dimly, and they had polished metal. And wouldn't that be a good description of the image on the shroud? This ghostly, it's not like our mirrors today. Now we see the face of Christ dimly as in a mirror, but when he comes back, we're going to see him face to face. So that's a text that should be considered. Okay, here's another one. Colossians chapter 1, verse 15. Scholars believe this is the beginning. It goes to, as I recall, verse 20 of an ancient Christian hymn. And Paul takes this hymn and he opens it. I don't know if this is where the hymn began, but it begins there in 15. He says, who is the image of the invisible God? Now that relative pronoun doesn't, the antecedent, if you go back further, it's Jesus Christ. But isn't that, to me, that's very fascinating because you've got a Christian hymn. It has a poetic structure to it. And we're talking about an image of the invisible God. How does something invisible have an image? And how would Christians have perceived this image on the shroud, if it's authentic and if it exists? How would they have perceived it? Would it have been perceived as, image of an invisible God? That might be a good way. Was it? Yeah. Was it? A lot of the scholars will associate the source of this statement with maybe Sophia, the wisdom literature in the Old Testament. Philo uses the logos, the word. Where did they get this source to speak of this image, the icon of the invisible God? And I think basically, I just think that this is a possible reference that we should consider, and that Paul is it may be that the Gentiles were thinking more in the thought of Plato, where at the time of death, the immaterial soul leaves the body. And of course, you've got Gnosticism, which developed about in Greek thought that the body really isn't something desirable. And Paul, when he talks about in that Galatians chapter 2, that Christ was God in his fullness, in bodily form. Maybe Paul there is wanting to take that hymn and emphasize it's not that the body is important. This is the image of the invisible God, but there was a bodily resurrection. And it's not just the soul departing and, that's it. And the body turns to dust, but he was bodily raised. Now, another text in Paul, before we leave Paul, I think 2 Timothy 4:13, where Paul, in his last chapter of literature we have from him, says to Timothy, bring the cloak that I left at Troas with Cleopas, and also the books, especially the parchments. And I'm intrigued there that this cloak, like the mantle that Elijah and Elisha had, there are textual, historical, geographical, and typological reasons to consider the cloak as being a cryptonym for the shroud. Textually, it's fascinating because, usually in Greek, your object's going to follow the verb. But this sentence opens up the cloak, the one I left at Troas with Cleopas. Is that the guy? Cephas, I think. I don't remember. But he says, when you come, bring. Now, in Greek, if you want to emphasize something, you can move it forward for emphasis. So the very first word in the sentence, before the verb is the object, it's the cloak. He doesn't say my cloak, bring the cloak. And as far as typology, this word is related to, in the Greek Orthodox Church, there's the vestments, and a particular vestment, outer garment. And I think there's a good reason to believe that a lot of these vestments in the church actually have a root, a source in the shroud. The stole, for example, and then on the tablecloth or on the altar. There's typological and historical reasons for that. Geographically, Troas is right there on the Mediterranean Sea, on the western edge there of Asia Minor. And we know on the second missionary journey, Paul goes to Troas and he crosses the Aegean Sea there over to Macedonia, answered the Macedonian call. Now, if I was taking a voyage across in an open ship, I would want a cloak. I would want some warmth and protection from the weather. I wouldn't leave it behind in Troas. I'd want to take it on my voyage. Why did he leave it at Troas? Now, it's possible on the third missionary journey, he comes back the other way. It's possible he had it and left it then. We can't say for sure, but I'm intrigued anyway that there's a textual, historical, geographical, and typological reasons consider that maybe that's a cryptonym for the shroud. So that's Paul, the ones that come to mind. I think we gave 4.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, so after that, I could do Matthew real quick because I don't think he's the best, but Matthew's got a couple. Matthew talks about there's 2 extraordinary miracles that Jesus does. As I recall, he heals a man's withered hand. But the Pharisees don't because he did it on the Sabbath. That wasn't any good. You shouldn't have done that. You did it on the wrong day. And so he follows it up with an exorcism. And now that they say, well, you did that by the power of Beelzebub. You're working with the devil. You're in cahoots with him. If we want to see a sign from heaven, that is from the hand of God. And Jesus says, no sign will be given to this evil, wicked generation except the sign of Jonah. What's that sign of Jonah? I think Matthew knew, but he doesn't tell us. And we could spend some time on that because it's a fascinating text. Just the word sign. In the Old Testament, you've got the rainbow. It comes from the Greek term, or sema, is a mark.
Mm-hmm.
Simeon, the sign, it comes from sema, the mark. And so you've got the mark of Cain. You've got the mark in the sky, the rainbow. You've got maybe the symbol on the front of a ship. And you've got on a soldier's shield a mark so he can tell his shield from somebody else's. And isn't it interesting, on the shroud, we've got all these marks, all this graphic torture, the marks. And a sign then is signifies something. And the key here, let me say this, because this, I really like Gary Habermas. Okay, and he, you asked him to come on your broadcast and discuss this, and he was busy. He's busy writing his magnum opus.
Yeah.
And so, but he took a look at this text and he said, well, there's nothing there about a shroud. And I wanted to ask him, and I didn't want to get any argument or anything, but I wanted to ask him, well, the main clue we have there, right, in my in the book and on this text, I've got, I don't know, 10, a dozen different what I call identifying markers. What is the sign of Jonah? And there's some clues. There's 10 or 12 clues from the text. But the best one is, just as Jonah was in the belly of the sea monster for 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. And I wanted to ask Habermas, well, when Jesus was in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights in the tomb, wasn't he within a shroud? Wasn't he wrapped within a shroud? Well, and of course, yes, he was. That's exactly where he was. He was inside a shroud for 3 days and 3 nights. And so there's and if you go, here's the thing about that text too. If you go on 4 chapters later, beginning of chapter 16, first reference is chapter 12, verse 38 and following. 4 chapters later, chapter 16, the subject's opened again. His opponents come and say, we want to see a sign from heaven, from God himself. And he gives this interesting response. It's synonymous parallelism. He says, well, you guys, you know how to tell. You look at the sky and it's red, and you say, oh, it's going to rain tomorrow, and it's another color, it's going to be fair weather. You know how to discern the appearance of the sky, but you don't know the signs of the time. Now, what's fascinating to me about that synonymous parallelism, is the word for appearance. The appearance of the sky is prosopon, the appearance. And it matches in that parallel structure with the word signs. Okay? Do you understand? You know the appearance of the sky, but you don't know the signs of the time. So they match parallel.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what's fascinating is in the next chapter, as he prepares us for the transfiguration, that story opens up with the garments of Christ being brilliant, white like the sun. His face shines like the sun. Well, the word for face is prosopon. This is a word that has this double meaning. A person's appearance is often, even like the shroud, the face is the most prominent part of your appearance. And so you know how to tell the face of the sky, but you don't know the signs of the time. So face is in parallel with signs. Is that a clue from Matthew that the sign of Jonah is about the face? It's about the image on the burial shroud when Jesus was in the belly of the earth, or the heart of the earth, for 3 days and 3 nights. And there's a number of Matthew's passage, his story of the transfiguration, which is very important in the early church. It's in every synoptic gospel. And John alludes to it in his gospel in the first chapter when he says that Christ tabernacled among men. Okay, so this story was and Jesus said, don't tell this vision that you have until the Son of Man's raised from the dead. And I don't want to go into this text in length, but I think it's another. I think the shroud is in the background of the transfiguration, and I think we've got this clue from Matthew when he talks, right before that, he talks about, to you it's been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it's not been granted. Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, God, bless the Lord, that he would honor us to maybe understand some of the mysteries. And I think that Matthew there has given us a clue to what this, and again, the discipline of the secret, if they make mention of it, it's going to be discreet. They don't want it hunted down, confiscated. As Jesus said, don't cast your pearls before swine. But here's a clue as to what in my thinking, here's a clue about what the sign of Jonah is when he matches the face with the word sign. And then he uses the face in the story of the transfiguration, his garments and his face. And the word tabernacle is used in that story. Now, this becomes very important. Peter says, well, let's make three. Oh, we'll make 3 tabernacles. And I think it's Mark that says that he doesn't know why he said it. And that's kind of puzzling. Why you bring that up, Now, a tabernacle, there's 2 important aspects about it. And tabernacle means tent.
Larry, can I just...
Yeah, go ahead. I keep talking.
I don't want to interrupt you. I want you to make your case and stuff. But one thing that you said about the transfiguration, I can see a possible skeptic coming back, not so much against the shroud, but there are skeptics that will say, well, the transfiguration are just misplaced or out of context resurrection appearance narratives. So if you're kind of connecting the shroud now to the transfiguration, what's your take? Is there any confusion about, is the transfiguration some kind of confused resurrection appearance that's misplaced, or how would you respond to a skeptic who says that?
Well, okay, good question. I would respond that it's a foreshadowing of the resurrection, and that actually what happened in the tomb was probably a transfiguration event. When Jesus again glowed and such, and became materially transparent, it went even further, through the cloth. But I think he was preparing them for the resurrection and for the burial shroud. And what happened, this is how the image was formed during a transfiguration event. I think probably that occurred in the tomb.
Okay.
And it's just part of his Christology of us. He's the son of, the teaching lesson of the transfiguration is Jesus is king of the mountain. You've got Moses and Elijah, the prophets and the law and the prophets, and you've got Jesus. And in the early church, who are we going to listen to? Is Moses the king of the mountain, or is Jesus king of the mountain? And so only one tabernacle. We don't need 3. These are sacred tents, not just so the 2 aspects of a tent is a covering and an abode. And anyway, does that satisfy that, Dale? We can.
Yeah, perfect. Go ahead and keep on with your presentation. I think I know what your favorite one is. So, yeah.
Well, okay. So we talked about Paul. We talked about Matthew. There's 2 other canonical authors. Let's jump to John, okay? Because Stephanie, you mentioned too, John in the burial and the resurrection, chapter 20 there.
Yeah, that's actually one of my favorites.
Yeah, okay. And if I talk too much, just please interrupt me again. I just enjoy.
It's all good.
Okay, all good. Okay, all right. So John is fascinating. I used to not be quite as fascinating because he's so hard to difficult. What's going on here? But I think there's a number of pieces we can put together. Okay, so chapter 20, the women come to the tomb, and Mary, she looks in there, and there's no body, and so she reports to the disciples, hey, they've taken the Lord. So Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved, whom we think is John, they run to the tomb, and 4 different verbs in 4 verses for seeing, observing, are used. And with each verb, the first 3 are the historical present. In other words, they're told in the present, although it's already happened. And that's a way to emphasize, try to draw you into what's happening here, looking in and seeing. And each of these 4 verbs to see, they're different. it's like, okay, first you just kind of glance and then, wait a minute, let me take a second look. And what? So each one kind of draws you more into the suspicion, the mystery of what is happening. And so finally they go in, as I recall, Peter goes in first, and then when John comes in, it says he saw and believed. Now, neither of those verbs have an object. What did he see, and what did he believe? Now, some conclude that he ended up believing what Mary had told them, that they'd taken the body away. Robbers have come, or the soldiers or somebody took the body. And so some conclude that's what he believed. I don't think that's at all what he believed. If we look at how pistuo is, the verb to believe, is used throughout John, and especially as it continues, the end of the chapter, these things these signs, many other signs Jesus did in the presence of his disciples, they're not written in these books, but these have been written in order that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. So to believe in the Gospel of John is to put your faith in Christ. And so when it says he saw and believed, I conclude he's come to believe in the resurrection, and as Jesus is the Son of God. Okay. So what is it that he saw? Well, interesting, the verb kimai is used 4 times, just like we have 4 different verbs. We have one verb for seeing, for lying. They see the funeral linens lying or reclining. And 3 times it's in the present. And then there's a 4th time in verse 12 where Mary is talking to the angels, as I recall, or is it when the Lord comes and talks to her? But in that conversation with Mary, it's either the angels, I think it's the angels. She looks in, there's 2 men, and well, he's not here. Look where he was lying, where his body was lying. That's a past tense. It's an imperfect. He was lying there, but he no longer is. So the funeral linens are still lying, but Jesus isn't lying with them. Okay, so whatever they saw, this verb lying, and it's always with reference to the funeral linens, and then he's not lying with those linens. So here's what I want to share with you on this. I think the important verb is actually a perfect tense. Back in chapter 19. It's either 40 or I think it's 44, 1944, where we're told that Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea take the body of Jesus and they wrap it in the funeral linens with the spices. And it doesn't say bound. I'm incorrect. It doesn't say they wrapped him or his body. It says they bound him or his body. And so it's in the perfect tense. Now, what the perfect tense does is it says there's an action that's been completed, but there's a continuous result that continues on. From the completed act, there's a continual result, effects. Now, another perfect tense is used in chapter 20, verse 7 for the face cloth, the siderium. And it says that when they looked in there and they saw the siderium not lying with the funeral linens, but separate, rolled up separately from the linens.
Okay.
Now, excuse me, that also is a perfect tense. Here's what I conclude from this, and I think this is significant. Whenever you see a perfect tense, this isn't the normal past tense in the Koine Greek. Normally, you just state something in the past tense. Joe went to the store. Simple aorist tense. Now, if you said Joe went to the store and you put a perfect tense verb there, what that means is he not only went to the store, he's still at the store. He's still there. Okay? So when it says in chapter 19, verse, I think it's 44, it could be 40, they took the body of Jesus and they bound it. They bound it with a strip of linen. John uses this verb in the book of Revelation for the dragon, binding the dragon with chains. There's a prisoner motif often with this verb. So they have bound Jesus like a prisoner. He's captive, just like Jonah was captive in the belly of a fish. And then the Lord had the fish release him. So Jesus in the tomb was bound in this linen. And what I think is significant is that back in chapter 11, we've been prepared for this. When Lazarus is raised by Jesus, we're told that he is bound. Now, the same verb in perfect tense, there, verb with a perfect tense is used for how Lazarus was bound with linen strips. And there's a kyria, these probably more than one, and Jesus may have had more than one, binding the linen shroud to the body. And then the command is given when Lazarus comes forth, Jesus says, unbind, untie him, let him loose, let him free. Now, here's what I think we're set up to understand in the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus has also been bound in linens. And what they see when they enter the tomb, the linens are still bound, but there's no body. As the angel said, he was lying there, but he's not lying there anymore. But the funeral linens still are. Just like the siderium, it's just like it was on Friday. On Good Friday, they took the siderium, they rolled it up, and they set it aside. Same thing with the body of Jesus. They bound it in linens, they put it in the tomb, and when they came on Sunday morning, the linens are still bound. They're still lying there, but there's no body. And that's how John is able to conclude there's a resurrection. We're teased. John teases us. Some people are going to be informed that there's a burial shroud with the image of Christ on it that was left behind. Well, of course, that's inside. John's not going to be able to see that. That's on the inside. And he's just, but we're teased. That's why there's no object for the verb, in my opinion. Yeah, he's teasing us, see? And this idea of Jesus materially becoming transparent or dematerializing, I don't know if that's the best verb, but the idea that he went through his burial cloth and they're still tied. The next three stories affirm this. First of all, Mary. Jesus is nowhere to be found, but then suddenly he says her name and she turns and there he is. He just suddenly appears. And then that evening, behind locked doors, we're told the doors are locked, they're shut, and Jesus suddenly appears. He apparently became materially transparent and went right through the wall. And 1 week later, that happens again. So the next three stories, we have Jesus doing something with his body, his glorious resurrected body that he hasn't done before, where he's able to go through locked doors and be present or suddenly appear. And I think something like that, I think that's related to also to what happened at the resurrection. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's part of John. There's something else about John, but any comments you guys want to make or questions about that text?
I have a general question. So I don't know if you want to finish off your presentation, then should I save it? But basically, I'll leave it up to you. My question is kind of a general thing because I can see perhaps there are Shroud skeptics in the audience, maybe, and stuff. And if they're listening to these Bible verses and your explanations, someone might just kind of dismiss what you're saying and say, well, this is just pure eisegesis. It isn't proper exegesis. So how do you, how do you kind of ensure that you're not just letting your bias as a pro Shroud guy cause you to commit eisegesis, and that we're doing proper exegesis out of the text?
Okay. Well, everything I've mentioned so far is from the text, and it's the verbs a lot that I'm focusing on. So I'm not bringing anything out from the outside in. In historical research, again, we can't use a scientific method. We can't do a lab experiment and repeat things. On the historical research, you look at the evidence you have, and scientifically, we have a lot of good forensic evidence. But I'm a textual exegete. I'm an exegete. I'm an exegete, and so I'm just trying to take the text and decipher what the writer is intending us to understand. And again, he's being discreet. If my inferences are correct about the discipline of the secret and the don't cast your pearls before swine, and I don't see anything that would be more holy to the early Christians than his burial shroud with this miraculous image and his holy blood on it. And if you're not going to cast your pearls before swine, seems like that's first on the list. So I don't see any eisegesis I've done. I've tried to explain the verbs to you. The perfect tense is the key, in my opinion. His body has been bound, and we're set up for it with Lazarus, who's told to unbind him. And you have to decide for yourself what you make from the 4 references about those linens are lying and what they see. And maybe you've got maybe somebody's got a better explanation, but I've tried to look at the clues that were given and make my result from that. So anyway, I haven't touched on, I think we haven't touched on the 2 best references yet.
Awesome. Cool. Just before we do that, SJ, did you have any questions before we move on?
I just wanted to comment really quickly because there's a little chatter going on in the chat, and people are wondering about Stirp and what Stirp's findings were. So just for the audience, for your own sake, take some time and go to theshroud.com, and that's where you're going to see a lot of information with respect to the Shroud that was put on there by Barry Schwartz, who was one of the original Stirp people. And so his findings were laid out pretty clear, and that it was not the product of an artist. That's the exact quote from the words. Yeah. And the other thing that I wanted to just mention really quickly is the image of the Shroud probably appeared more bold. I mean, it probably appeared less faded 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. And so that's why there was a reaction, I think, to what Larry said about John 20, how John reacted. He was kind of like, he believed. And that was pretty significant. But the other thing is we also have like the Hungarian Prey Codex and a number of other art pieces through the centuries that have duplicated some of the stuff that's on the Shroud, like the 4 fingers showing and a lot of the other stuff. And so I just wanted to point those things out.
Awesome. All right, cool. Larry, over to you for the 2 best. I'm looking forward to this. So
okay, yeah, well, thank you. So Stephanie, what you said triggered something too about John's text. This isn't, I don't think this is eisegesis either. This is, people can make what they want from it. But then you have the story of Thomas, doubting Thomas, who wasn't there. There's interesting apocrypha story about where he was, but we don't have time for that. But what is interesting, I think, is that the very wounds that Thomas is invited to inspect. Look, here are the prints on my hands and my feet, and here's the spear in my side. These are the very wounds that we're invited today to behold on the Shroud image. Is that just a coincidence? People have to decide for themselves. But, I read it that he teases us. He doesn't see the image when he enters. That's on the inside of the cloth. But he doesn't give us an object, because that's what we're going to think. If we know about the Shroud, we're going to think about the image. And so he teases us that way. But I think the verbs tell us that they saw the linens as they were when they initially were wrapped. Perfect tense. They're still that way, but there's no body. What would you conclude if you saw that? You'd have to, he must have been resurrected because he wasn't stolen. Where'd the body go? But okay, so let me move on, and I'll set it up because there's another important story that John tells us in his gospel that's going to serve for one of the, what I think are one of the, there's two better texts. So in chapter 19, verse 34, only John speaks of the spear being thrust into our Lord's side while he was on the cross. Now, as you read that passage, he talks about, this is really true. It really happened. And I tell you, I witnessed it. I saw it. And it could be that the witness is the soldier who saw it and not the writer. So it's a little ambiguous there. But he says, this testimony is true. And maybe I should even read it because I'm not doing a very good job quoting it. This is 1934. One of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately there came out blood and water. And he who has seen has borne witness, and his witness is true, and he knows that he's telling the truth, so that you also may believe. Believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Now, why is that account so important to the writer? He says, I witnessed it. I tell you, it's true. It really happened. And my witness is true. Now, this is something that's very significant to the author. Now, I submit to you the most plausible explanation is because some of his readers are aware that there's a burial shroud with a miraculous image that's John and others would say this is from Jesus's tomb. And they know about that prominent stain on the side of the man of the cloth. And so by saying this, John is saying, I saw it happen. My witness is true. That stain that's on that cloth, that's Jesus's burial shroud. That happened on the cross. And it's the very wound that, Thomas is invited to inspect and we can look at today. But here's where I want to go next with that one. But that's my, other people can come to other conclusions, but I think that story, the best, Occam's razor, the easiest explanation without making a lot of inferences is likely correct.
Yep.
Why is this so important to John? Well, it's because people are aware of an image of a crucified man on a burial cloth where this prominent stain on the image is this wound in the side of the man. And John's given an explanation of what that wound, how it came about. And he's testifying that those two go together. That shroud goes with what happened on the cross. Okay? So, people can say that's eisegesis, but it fits.
Gotcha.
Now here's what in my opinion, here's the two. Have we got time for some more? We haven't got to the two best, in my opinion.
Yeah, let's cover the two best.
We could probably go till I can go till 2:30. I know it's 2:07 here where I am right now.
Oh, I better hurry up. Okay, I'll just give you a brief. Okay, so we go to 1 John 5, the same writer in his letter, chapter 5, verse 5, verse 6. This is the one who came by water and blood, not by the water only, but by the water and by the blood. And it's the Spirit that bears witness, and his testimony is true. And there are three who are testifying: the Spirit, the water, and the blood. And these three are one. If we are receiving the testimony of men, the testimony of God is greater. For the testimony of God is this, that he has borne witness, or he has testified concerning his Son. The one who believes in the Son has the witness in himself. The one who doesn't believe has made God a liar, because he's not believed in the testimony that God testified concerning his Son. And then he concludes it by saying, I write this in order that you may know or be assured that you have eternal life. And the theme of that passage is about the one who believes in Jesus has victory over the world. Jesus says, I overcame the world. So eternal life, okay? Now, that's a very puzzling passage. What in the world is John talking about there? You talk about being cryptic. I think that's, this is the one who came by water and blood, not by the water only, but by the water and the blood. And the three are bearing witness. That's a pretty cryptic text, okay? Well, to begin with, there's only one other place where John, and I think any of the writers, will use these two nouns together and do so also without the definite article, water and blood. This is the one who came by water and blood. Well, when he told the story about the spear, he said, and out came blood and water. The same two nouns, although they're reversed, again, without the definite article. Now, Ben Withington published a peer-reviewed paper in the prestigious Oxford Journal, New Testament Times, or New Testament Studies. And this was 30, 40 years ago. I think it was the early 91, 89. It's been a while. But Withington thinks that what is meant there is Mary's amniotic fluid, that this is the one who came by a physical birth, by water and blood. And he sees that as the birth, okay? That's one interpretation. In my, I have to hurry here. In my book, and I think I've written a paper on this too, there's three common views through the history of the church for this passage, this puzzling passage. Let me say this. There's a Jewish hermeneutic. One of the basic Jewish hermeneutics is that when a writer uses words, the same words elsewhere, he uses it similarly, it's likely these two things are linked together. In other words, a Jew in his exegesis, when he reads about the spear and the blood and the water coming out, and then John later says, this is the one who came by water and blood, there's a reason why you might want to connect these two together, which Augustine did. Augustine thought somehow this passage is about the spear wound, the blood and the water. Okay. Now, we don't have time to talk about the theology or there's, I think, there's spiritual, we can spiritualize it, the water and the blood, the regeneration, the redemption, that okay. But here's what I want to say, because I want to get to the text, the Greek. Okay, first of all, you've got two nouns, both without the definite article, joined by the conjunction and both are governed by a single preposition, which is actually dia, it's through. Okay, now you can translate it by instrumental, and but I suggest to you, much like Withington thought, we should consider a locative through. Okay, so and I would say, and the verb there, came, can also be translated go or went. The prodigal son came to his father. We would say he went to his father. Okay, is he coming or going? So I suggest we translate the first phrase, this is the one who went or passed through water and blood. This is what happened, see, in the resurrection narrative. In John's gospel, he passed through the burial cloth, okay, stained with the water and blood. So I link this 1 John 5 with the spear wound, the water and blood, and the shroud itself. And the three that are bearing witness in Jewish jurisprudence, you need more than one witness. You need two or three to establish a truth. He's got three there: the water, the spirit, and the blood. All three are neuter in the noun, but he uses a masculine participle. He personifies spirit, water, and blood because they're witnesses. Well, they are witnesses of the witness of God, or I refer to it as the divine witness. John says, if we are receiving the witness of men, now that we do, I receive the witness of Paul and John and Peter and the apostles. And John will start that book and say, what I saw, what we touched, what we handled, we testify to you. We are witnessing to you. What we saw, we handled, we heard. And then he says, okay, if you're receiving my testimony or the witness of men, there's a greater testimony, there's a greater witness. And there's three that are testifying on behalf of God's witness: the spirit, the water, and the blood. Now, twice, this is a chiasmus. I believe in the structure. Chiasmus is a Semitic structure. You build and then you come back. And so the focal point is at the center. And twice you have a perfect tense again with the verb to testify. And it's used in reference to God himself and his own testimony. Twice it says you have the witness, or you can translate it testimony, the testimony of God that he testified concerning his son. Now, what is that? What is the divine witness that God testified? Long ago he testified on the cross and in the tomb. There was something that was done, and there are, from the perfect tense, there's continuing effects from what God did then. There's something that's continued on, so that you can even talk about it in the present tense. There's three that are testifying today, right now, and when John's writing: the spirit, the water, and the blood. Well, that stain was testifying before their eyes. That miraculous image of the spirit is God's testimony. It's the divine witness. It's a greater witness than man will give you about the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Christ. I've always thought that the testimony of Paul is just fantastic. This persecutor of the church who becomes the Apostle Paul. I mean, how does that happen? And eventually he's beheaded. That, to me, that's great testimony. But John says there's a greater testimony than man's testimony. And that's the testimony that God himself testified. And there's something from it that still exists when John is writing this letter years later, that he can say it in perfect tense. There's something that God is still testifying today. And there's three that bear witness to it: the spirit, the water, and the blood. What's a miraculous image, so the spirit testifies to it. And the water and the blood, that stain is still there. And we can't replicate it. We cannot duplicate it with 21st century technology. And we can't explain it. It's inexplicable and it's irreproducible. It's God, it is the divine witness to the gospel. Now, bless his heart, Gary Habermas recently talked about 5 early witnesses for the resurrection, like the conversion of James, the half-brother of Jesus, the conversion of Saul, the early Christian creeds, and that's great. But I would suggest to you, there's a greater witness than the 5. He unfortunately, and I know Gary believes that the Shroud is likely authentic, but I think the earliest and the best witness we have is the witness that God gave us himself. And it's called the witness of God. And you can find it again in the gospel. John chapter 5, verse 37, Jesus will call forth several witnesses, because the Jews will say, well, you're just testifying about yourself. He says, well, I've got John the Baptist. He testified concerning me. and I've got my works, the miracles, you know, and I've got the scriptures. And he says in verse 37 there, he says, my Father has testified of me. It's a perfect tense. I would suggest we understand it much like he says the night of his arrest. He tries to calm the fears of his disciples. He says, don't worry, I have overcome the world. Well, that's a past tense. He's got the cross before him. But sometimes we can read that as a reader, we can understand he did overcome it. But did he overcome it at that time? So anyway, that's
one of them.
I've got much more time. That go ahead.
Go ahead, because we got 10 minutes. Go ahead and give the final best text.
Final. Because
I have a general question after that. So
okay, yeah. So I think this passage in 1 John chapter 5, where twice it says the witness of God that he testified concerning his son, and the verb's in the perfect tense. He testified it, that on the cross and on the day of the resurrection, but there's something that has continued on in the present day where the testimony is still valid. It still is there. And in the present tense, the Spirit, the witness, and the blood is testifying to it. Jewish jurisprudence. God's testimony has three witnesses to affirm it: the Spirit, the water, and the blood. You see? So that is one of the two most powerful ones, I think, in myself, that I think we have. But it relies on the gospel. It relies on the spear wound that we're told about in the gospel, which I think as readers we're familiar with. Okay. Now here's the other one, and that's from the book of Hebrews. That's one of the four canonical authors. We looked at Paul and Matthew and John. There's another Bible author who makes mention of the shroud. And I think there's four references to it in the letter to the Hebrews. And this is again in a chiasmus, A, B, B prime, A. Now, A is the curtain. In the tabernacle, you had the curtain that divided the two compartments, the holy place from the Holy of Holies. Okay. And in chapter 6, verse 19 and 20 of the book of Hebrews, he talks about Jesus having gone through the curtain and has entered into the sanctuary. Okay. B is about the greater, more perfect sacred tabernacle. The greater, more perfect tabernacle. Okay. Now, tabernacle, skini, is a tent. And it's a sacred tent. It's not just Isaac's tent. Later, the Hebrew writer will mention the patriarchs, and they dwelt in tents. My wife and I were married nearly 50 years ago, went to Palestine. Her parents were missionaries over there. And we visited with the nomads, the out there in the desert, living in tents. And two aspects of a tent is it's a covering and it's a place of abode, like a residence. And these nomads, they had a large tent that covered them, open air, and it was their residence. It was an abode. Now, for 3 days, Jesus was in the heart of the earth, the sign of Jonah. For those 3 days, he was within a covering. For 3 days and 3 nights, that was the abode. That was the residence of God, the Son of God. His residence, his abode was in a tent, a typology. See, the writer of Hebrews makes a lot of typology. He talks early in chapter 9 about the earthly sanctuary. Then he starts he's talking about these types and shadows. How Jesus is a high priest. He's a priest after the order of Melchizedek. He's a king and a priest. So typology is very important here. And this is part of how the early Christians, I think, viewed the shroud and viewed its image. So A is the curtain. B is the compartment, the tabernacle itself. And the high point of this, the first B is chapter 8, verse 2, where it says that Jesus, he was a minister in the tabernacle pitched by God, not by man. that Moses, he pitched the tabernacle in the wilderness, but God has pitched a greater tent. Chapter 8, verse 2. And then you go B prime. So we got A curtain, chapter 6, B 8:2, and then B prime in this chiasmus is chapter 9, and that's verses 11 and 12. And here's what he says. This is maybe the best single example we have in the text. Although I love 1 John 5. He says, when Jesus appeared when he appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, and then there's no verb, through or by the greater, more perfect sacred tent or tabernacle, not made by human hands, that is not of this creation, and not through or with the blood of bulls and goats, but through or with his own blood, he entered the sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, the heavenly sanctuary, to make eternal redemption once for all. Now, the question is, what is this greater, more perfect sacred tent? A covering and an abode. And in my research, I come up with as many as 7 different suggestions that scholars have made through the centuries as to what is this greater, more perfect sacred tent. Okay. And you wonder, why is the writer so interested in the first compartment rather than the second? He entered the sanctuary. But the first one, and there are 2, the syntax, he didn't enter the sanctuary and then enter it again. The grand tabernacle, the grand structure has 2 compartments, the front and the back, the outer court and the inner compartment, the holy place and the Holy of Holies. And this first compartment is the greater, more perfect one. That's the one he spends all his time talking about. Okay. Now 5 of those 7 said it's something to do with his body. The early church, the church fathers, when they commented on this, like John Chrysostom in the late 4th century, he said, well, that's his flesh, that's his humanity, because in chapter 10, which is B prime, 10, 19, and 20, it says he's inaugurated for us a new way to approach God through the curtain that is by his flesh. Now, actually, there's no preposition, but you take it from the former clause. It talks about by his blood. He's inaugurated for us a new way to approach the presence of God, having gone through the curtain. And most translations, most commentaries think flesh there is a metaphor. I don't think it's a metaphor. I think it's a literal. And I think you take the preposition from the Greek structure that just went before, and it's by or through. You got the preposition through. You don't have the, do you there? Let's see. No, you don't. You don't have through. You got in before it. But it's, so here's what I think. I got to wrap this up. Here's what I think. 5 of these 7 views say it's something to do with his body, his resurrected body, his fleshly body. John Chrysostom, when he was asked, well, it says not of this creation, like Witherton said, and I think this is a good objection I've got to answer, well, but it says not of this creation. Okay, well, that verb there, to create, it often is used for building and construction. And so it's a contrast with chapter 9, verse 1, where he begins his typology. He says there's an earthly sanctuary. It's built by man. So it's really those 2 phrases, explanatory phrases about the greater, more perfect tent. The first one is not of this creation. Or no, I'm sorry. The first one is not by human hands, which you know, Dale, later the Caito Poeta becomes the a name for this image that's being shown, a shroud, not made by human hands in like the 5th, 6th century. Well, you've got this phrase, or the negative is used, not by human hands. And then the second one explains that one. That is to say, not of this creation, not ordinary building, not of man's building. It's of God's. It's the tent that God pitched. Chapter 8, verse 2. Now, John Chrysostom, he said, well, he took it to be the physical body. And he explained it. He said, well, look, when Joseph, he turned to Matthew chapter 1, I think it's verse 40, 44. And Joseph said he was going to put Mary away. He wanted to do it discreetly. She was pregnant. And an angel, Michael, appears and said, don't be afraid. What is conceived is of the Holy Spirit. And so even Chrysostom, John the Golden Mouth, the preacher, the late 4th century bishop of Constantinople, and went on to Antioch and preached all these sermons. And when he preaches on this text in Hebrews, he says he's taught the greater, more perfect tent was the Son of God in his flesh, and that it wasn't ordinary building. It was, the Holy Spirit. He was the Son of God. And even Michael the angel said that it's not of man. It's not conceived of man. It's a virgin birth.
Okay.
But I think it just simply means it's a miraculous image. So here's what I think. The greater, more perfect tent is the shroud with a miraculous image. Not, as you said, Stephanie, it's not of man. It's not. Stirp concluded this is not the work of an artist. We can't replicate it. This is of God. This is a miraculous image. So it's not of this creation. And so it is about his body, it's about the tent that covered his body. And at the resurrection, he went through. Now, I've given you 3 passages where the New Testament, the early Christians understood that at the resurrection, his body went through the cloth. I gave you the Gospel of John 20. 20 there, and we gave you 1 John 5, and then you got Hebrews here where the preposition dia is used. So there's 3 different types I think the early church saw there in that passage regarding the shroud. The shroud became a type of the first compartment, and when Jesus at the resurrection went through, it was like going through the curtain, which is part of that first compartment that separates it from the second. And as he went, his entombment served as like a type of the first compartment. And when his body went through, he entered the heavenly sanctuary with his blood. Where's his blood? Well, it's right there on that's another type. It was a type of his high priestly garment. And this can all be done syntactically in the Greek with how you treat that first dia preposition. If it's instrumental, you can say, okay, how can he serve as a high priest if he didn't have a high priestly garment? If he didn't have a high priestly tunic? And the shroud has the 4 characteristics of a Jewish high priestly garment. It's got the fine weave, it's got the weave, the herringbone weave. It's supposed to have a checker work, this special weave, pure linen. It reaches down to the feet, and Aaron's tunic on Yom Kippur, the one day he goes in the Holy of Holies, he only wears his white tunic in there. He takes all this other, his breastplate and helmet. He takes out all off. All he wears is the white undergarment, goes into the holy place. And before that, some of the blood has to be sprinkled on his garment. Well, that's what happens on the shroud. It's got the blood of the sacrifice, the blood of the Son of God. And when he goes through it, he's got, it's like, this is his garment as he presents his sacrifice in the heavenly, there's blood there. So I think there's this typology and the curtain, 3 different ways. So,
all right.
Yeah, very
awesome.
nice.
Awesome. Yeah, cool. So, all right. So I know SJ has to go. So if you can just maybe answer in like 1 minute or a couple minutes, but at most kind of thing. But my general question, so shroud skeptics let's pretend they've been convinced by everything you've said, and they go, yeah, I think some or all of these Bible verses are talking about Jesus's burial shroud, and it had these amazing images on it. How do you then link that to the Shroud of Turin images in particular? How would you make that connection, I guess, if somebody wanted to deny that?
If I understand the question correctly, I would turn to the story about doubting Thomas. and how he's invited to inspect the very wounds that we see on the shroud.
Gotcha. So kind of like the unique marks match up, right? So
right, and this image fits only one person in history that we're aware of. I mean, you've got who was crucified with a crown of thorns. You've got all these puncture wounds on the head, like a crown, a bowl of thorns. Why would you do that? Why would you bury a convicted felon who's sentenced to death in a very expensive cloth? This is a very expensive fine linen cloth. It wasn't just your ordinary burial shroud.
awesome. All right, I'll hand the reins over to you, SJ, because I've taken over your show long enough. So
oh no, this is all good. I have a couple errands, that's all. But I just wanted to say thank you. I really appreciate going through the text, and you've given some really eye-opening information that I'd never considered. I really hadn't thought about the veil, and I have thought about the blood and water, because that's always such a curious phrase. So it's interesting to hear the idea of it being testimony. I think that is just how 2 or 3, because it reminds me of when the woman was being stoned, the adulteress, and all the people left. So there weren't 2 people to testify against her. And so I love that stuff. And so I think that you've been able to really dig through the Bible. Dig through the Bible and talk about this. So wonderful. And so I wanted to know, actually, for both of you, where can people find you? And I know that you're working on a book right now. So I wanted to see if you could share a little on that book, like what your focus is on the book.
Yeah, thank you. God has blessed me just to show me these things. And then Giulio Fanti is doing a series on the shroud. I think there's 6 or 7 volumes out, and he's asked me to do 2 volumes on this series. And so I'm just finishing. I've written. I'm just doing the final formatting. Probably this weekend I'll have it ready to send my manuscript to him. He's the editor, and so that's a series. It's going to be called, that first book, it's going to be volume 9 in this series that Giulio's putting together. It's a scholarly volumes. And it's on hidden references to the shroud, hidden references to the Holy Shroud in the Bible.
Awesome. Yeah. And audience is familiar with me. So I'm on YouTube or Rumble under Real Seekers, plural with an S, or also go to my blog, because I post up blogs with the sources, including sources of Larry's detailed papers as to what he was talking about today. So that's at realseekerministries.wordpress.com. So there's no S after Real Seeker. It's not plural for that. But yeah, that's how you find me.
Great. So I really appreciate everybody coming in here today. I want to say thank you to the people in the audience as well. If you're new here and you like this kind of content, please like and subscribe, and do come again. And so I also wanted to say, while Larry was talking, I look over at the YouTube to find that video that you talked about with David Falk. And so I found the video with David Falk. He's apparently offering something on the shroud. I didn't listen to it, obviously, because I'm listening to this, but I found what you're talking about. It was like a 20-minute video. And then you made a response, and I found that too. So it looks like some interesting stuff to dig into.
It is. Oh, yeah. I caused quite a stir on the SSG, and even Shroud skeptics like Hugh Ferry are kind of cutting up David Falk's take there. So I even quote Shroud skeptics going after him. So, yeah.
Good stuff. Yeah, Larry.
Yeah, I do have a website, if I could mention it. It's theincredibleShroud.com. TheincredibleShroud.com.
Let me ask you one last question. I forgot this. How long have you been looking into the shroud? How many years?
Well, extensively for about 5 years, just where my main focus has really been, pretty pervasive for about 5 years.
Wow. Yeah, we have another famous shroud person who was in the audience. I don't know if he's still here, but Joe Marino, who opened my eyes. Actually, when I started investigating it, because I thought for many years it was just a hoax. He was his stuff was one of the first pieces of information I came upon. So it was really good stuff.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So good. Well, everybody, please like, subscribe, as I said, and just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do, do it all in the glory of God. So, Joe Marino says, is one last thing from Joe. He says, is the word suckers found in any of the new translations?
Good old Joe.
All right. Thank you, guys. I'm going to go ahead and end this stream.
Take care.
Thank you.